Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 16th in our ongoing series of lectures on Middle Egyptian and hieroglyphics. Today, we will be covering some example sentences from chapters 7 and 8. As I've mentioned previously, the stative and prospective forms of the verb are rather difficult. Just the nature of them, they aren't immediately intuitive. I am therefore going to focus our examples very heavily on those forms. So that's the most important part of chapters 7 and 8, and it's the stuff that isn't just immediately obvious to someone who's done 1 through 6 and then read the chapters, but that might require a little more practice to understand. So do pay careful attention. These do show up in later chapters, of course. You will be seeing a lot of them, so make sure you understand them here. Feel free to leave any questions you have in the comments as well. I'm happy to answer them. So we'll start with sentence 3 from chapter 7. But this sentence is quite long. That's true the other one in chapter 7 as well. It's just something that happens when you're trying to do a bunch of examples of the perspective. You end up with a whole long string of dependent clauses. So in order to deal with that, we are going to split the sentence down the middle at the line between the independent and dependent clause and handle each one separately just so that it's more visible. Understand that this is all one sentence grammatically, but we just are splitting up as though it were two partial sentences, or really an independent clause and a dependent clause, and then you can just put them back together at the end. I have not done that. It's pretty simple, so left as an exercise for the reader. This is our first part of the sentence. I'll put down the transcription because it's pretty simple. You inu ni khardu nu hamnecher heri tep. And there is a Y there, even though it is not written. It's a vocabulary item. It's the kind of thing that ends up making a lot more sense. It's Haritep means chief. It's an adjective, whereas Haritep would be a prepositional phrase meaning on his head if you took it literally. So you have to take it as the vocabulary item. It makes infinitely more sense done that way. Haritep can be parsed as either a noun or as an adjective, though here it is an adjective. The parsing of the rest of the stuff. You is, of course, our participle. Inu. So ini is just a regular verb. It's in the circumstantial because it's immediately following you. That's what verbs in that's what if you see a verb following you, that's generally what it is. And we'll see with the rest of the sentence that parsing makes a lot of sense. There's also a W there, which is indicative of a passive form. It could also be indicative of a stative, but you don't usually see a stative right after you. And if you interpreted it that way, the rest of the sentence would kind of come out to be nonsense, like there wouldn't be anything happening in it. So you have to take it as the circumstantial form and as a passive circumstantial. And since that's a passive circumstantial, that NE is not the subject of it. Instead, we can take that as a dative, to me. And remember that usually the indirect object would follow the direct object, because we do need a direct object here, but that's not true if the indirect object is a preposition. Speaking of our direct object, we have a noun, exactly where we'd expect a direct object, hairdo. And then we have our genitive, nu, the plural genitive, so that just means of. Chemnecher is a noun, and haritep, as I mentioned here, is an adjective. And then we can take each word. So that inu as a verb, it means were brought or was brought. If we were to take the ne as modifying the inu as being like part of all that, it would become a present, and with the I as the subject, it would become something like I am brought the children, which doesn't really make any sense. I guess it could, but it just doesn't seem nearly as likely as saying the children of the chief priest were brought to me. Kerdu is children. Chemnecher is, of course, a kind of priest. I think usually it gets translated as lector priest, but priest is fine. Or you can take it literally, be like the priest who is the God's servant, if you really feel like being very full about it. And of course, Haritep chief. So we get a pretty simple sentence here once you come up with the best interpretation for that combination of verb, noun, and n, or verb, pronoun, and n. The children of the chief priest were brought to me. That's the simple part. Then we get into the more complicated part, the dependent clause, part 2. This one we can transcribe as di rech sen ta medet nefret. Now, let's break that down a little. So de is a verb with, a first person following it, first person pronoun. We remember that D is specifically the form of redi that you would expect to see in a prospective. Now, if you have paid close attention or read Chapter 7, you will know that redi is very commonly found in the prospective with another prospective following it. The prospective as the object of another prospective, something that is perfectly legal to do. A prospective phrase is a noun. And it ends up conveying the meaning of the subject has caused this prospective phrase, or causes, or whatever, whatever tense. And then since it's a prospective, it becomes something like in order to. So in order to cause is what you're getting out of DE. You would expect, because D is in a prospective, and because you aren't seeing like a preposition immediately after for something like to a point, maybe it could be like to cause to place something somewhere, but you should know in the back of your head it's probably going to be a prospective verb. Lo and behold, a prospective verb right after rech, which means to know. And since it's following a verb like a noun, we know it must be a nominal form. Since it has a suffix preposition right after, we can bet it's very likely not an infinitive. It could mean their knowing as an infinitive being possessed, but that seems less likely than that they know. Or perhaps that they are informed or something like that. It's a little awkward in English to precisely ram it in, but you get the sense that they're going for. The desired outcome is that they know, and then the rest of this, pretty simple, ta medet nefret, this beautiful thing. If this were being spoken in like the 18th dynasty, you could say that ta is the, and that had kind of slipped in, because by that point it kind of did. But assuming that this is good Middle Egyptian of the 12th dynasty, ta is just another form of this. Medet nefret, medet meaning thing, and nefret very common for good or beautiful. So this whole part becomes, in order to inform them, literally, in order to cause that they might know, but we can just say inform because we don't need to be convoluted about it, of this good thing, this beautiful thing. Whole sentence would be, the children of the chief lector priest were brought to me in order that I might inform them of this beautiful thing. To inform is a little impersonal. I think my initial translation there isn't amazing, because it kind of skips over the I part. In order that I might inform them of this beautiful thing, or maybe tell them. There's a few lines you can go here, but in order that I might tell them of this beautiful thing. My apologies for the minor omission there. Our next example is another one we're going to have to split up. This one I actually think is a really good example to have also. These exact words, I don't know where they might come from. This kind of thing, pharaohs say it all the time. All of the time, constantly. You will find anytime you see like a boundary stela or a royal proclamation of any sort, or even like a coronation proclamation, you are going to see a sentence that looks a heck of a lot like this one. So let's dive into it. Here's the first part. breaking off after the end of the first dependent clause because the main clause is quite short. Eat, hemef, redef, isfet, ta, pen, jeref. This is the other meaning of ta, by the way. This is the noun form. You can tell because it's written completely differently, even though it's pronounced the same. The first thing you might be thinking when you look at this is, why is there a T after the main verb? Shouldn't that be a circumstantial? Ordinarily, yes, except that this is a very specific use case of the infinitive called the caption style or the journal entry style. You would expect this sentence to appear underneath a carving of the king doing this, doing what he's doing in the sentence, or otherwise in some kind of historical anno. This is just how the Egyptians wrote down their history. It's a little idiomatic, but they'd write it as a bit, instead of really a sentence, this is technically, quote unquote, a big long noun phrase clarifying what is going on in a picture. But because that's not necessarily how we caption pictures, we do sometimes, but not often, and it's certainly not how we would ordinarily speak, we will treat it as though it is a main verb. That is a perfectly fine way to translate it in this context. But yes, you would be correct in assuming that something is a little off because our first verb is an infinitive. And then we have a noun following it, okay? With the infinitive context, it's a possessive relationship, but that's fine. We could also kind of pretend that it's a main verb and its subject because it's identical in our translation. Technically, it's possessive. And then we have another verb, redef, which is in the perspective, and that starts our first subordinate clause. Redef, isfet, ta, pen, jeref. Isfet is a noun. Our preposition governing ta, a noun that we know well. Pen, modifying it. And then an idiomatic phrase that gets covered here, jer, which is, it's a prepositional phrase, but it means to the limit, to the extent, i.e., all of it. Especially with that F at the end, making it all of it and not just all. So these are our parts of speech, and then we can look at the meaning of the individual words, which I'll just drop down. Eat, as an infinitive, is not just to come, but it is coming, in the sense of the coming of His Majesty. Red means to eliminate. It's also got the he in it. Isfet means corruption. Of course, it has a few meanings, but in this case it means in. Ta, the common word for land. Pen is this. And then jeref is our idiom, literally to its limit, but figuratively all of it in its entirety. And then if we break all this down, so the first bit is eat hemef, the coming of His Majesty. All right, fine, simple enough. Our perspective is to eliminate. It's third person, so it's he eliminates, and then in the perspective, so it should be in order that he might eliminate, or so that he can eliminate, or something like that. His Majesty is not just showing up for fun, he's doing it in order to eliminate corruption. And where is he eliminating the corruption? Got a helpful adverbial comment for that. Ta pen jeref. In this land in its entirety, in this entire land. If we take it as a main verb, you can say His Majesty came in order to eliminate corruption in this land in its entirety. You could take it as the infinitive, the coming of His Majesty in order to eliminate corruption in this entire land, in all of this land. There's two different idioms at play here. So you could translate this in any number of ways. All that matters is that you're getting the sense that the king is showing up and sweeping away corruption in the whole country. Any variant of that would be a perfectly acceptable translation. If I were grading a quiz or a homework with this on it, I would give you 100 points for anything that was, that got that meaning across adequately. The important thing here is the relationship between those two verbs and the subject. Now we have another slightly shorter subordinate clause. Turns out the king is coming to do multiple things. He is a multitasker. Df rech mute tash es mute. It should be immediately obvious that this is a prospective subordinate clause, because you see a clause has just logically ended. Let's say we decided to do our translation this way, and you didn't write it all down. You wrote down one clause, or you wrote down one section and another section. You see, okay, a whole thought has gone through, a clause has ended, and then you see D, and you know immediately that you have made the correct assessment about where the clause ends, and you have also that you have a new one in general. DF, he is causing something to happen. It's a prospective form. You're expecting another thing that is going to be going on. You should probably suspect that it is going to be a prospective verb following it. And then you find rech, and yes, it is a prospective verb. So DF, that he might cause. Rech means knowledge. It's because of its positioning, we can say very likely a prospective. It's unlikely that it would be an infinitive. It could grammatically, but it probably won't logically, because it would be tough to cause knowledge or knowing, but it's easy to cause something to, like, cause someone to know something, to tell them, to inform them. This is basically the same thing we got in the last sentence, actually. And there is, in fact, a noun after mute. We would expect that from a perspective. And then another noun, tash, in possession, and then mute. It gets a little idiomatic, but that whole thing is, first you have your subject, which is in a possessive relationship with tash, and then an adverbial comment coming in the form of a prepositional phrase, mute. All right, so what does that mean? DF, to cause, rech, to know. In order that he might cause something, the subject, mute, meaning city, to know, tash es, her boundary, its boundary, her, because cities are feminine in Egypt, mute, from another. Doesn't usually mean from. This one's also a bit of an idiom, but that's what it's getting at here. So putting the whole thing together, and, because we're in the middle of the sentence, and so that he might cause the towns to know their boundary from one another. Well, cause one town to know its boundary from another. Again, a little bit weird, a little bit idiomatic. The sense you need to be getting here, rather than fiddling with individual wording, is the way that DF is interacting with rech as the two perspectives, one after the other, and the general sense that he's telling towns where their boundaries are from one another. You don't have to achieve the most elegant expression of that, just get across that you understand the relationship between the verbs and that, like, noun plus adverbial phrase at the end there. So those are only two that we're going to go over from chapter 7. We're going to do a couple from chapter 8 as well. These are a little bit shorter. So this is the first sentence in chapter 8. It's kind of short. This one does not have a stative. Unfortunately, there are only 3, I think, that have answers given in chapter 8, and 8.6 is very long. It would be tough to put that into this format. So we're going to do 8.1 and 8.3, because this one, memory serves, does have a perspective. It certainly has a few things of value in it. So starting with our transcription, we have acha en. So that is our narrative sentence starter, an alternative to you that you're using when you're telling a story. Pretty simple. We have already covered that, but that's going to show up quite a bit from here on out, so good to recognize. Mech en wa em na en a rf em bot net shema. All right, start going over the parts of speech here. Mech en is going to be our verb. You can see the subject right after wa. And in fact, we have a whole long phrase that's acting as a subject. Wa em na and is in its entirety the subject of the sentence. Then rf em bot net shem. Em bot net shem, the whole thing ends up being an adverbial comment, and rf is another noun. And then we'll write down the meaning of each of the words. So we have achaen is our participle. That whole phrase ends up, the whole long thing after mech and filled works out to one of these donkeys. Na'en is the plural form of the demonstrative. La'a is, of course, donkeys. It could also mean great, but there's a donkey determinative, so it's pretty obvious which one is being meant. Wa is one, and just one of these. M wouldn't ordinarily be one. Here it might be a little more literal to say like one among these donkeys, but that seems kind of convoluted in English. So it's better to just take it as of and recognize that's an unconventional meaning. RF is its mouth, or his mouth, but we usually say it for donkeys. And then M bot net shem is with, because remember M can mean with in the sense of like a tool or implement. Like if you're doing something with something, like you wouldn't say if you're going to the store with someone, you wouldn't use M that way. But if you are fixing a leak with tape, then you would use M for that one. And then bot net shem is a shoot of barley with net as our possessive. The whole thing taken together, relatively simple sentence. Thereupon one of these donkeys filled its mouth with a shoot of Upper Egyptian barley. Filling your mouth is a very common, well, at least relatively common Egyptian idiom for eating, I think. Yeah. Or putting something in your mouth or something like that. They don't say eating as often as they say stuff like that. Like I think it comes up in Shipwreck Sailor as well, that the guy, when he lands on the island and he's hungry, he tries to find something, see if there's anything he could put into his mouth rather than if there's anything that he could eat. All right, and then our final sentence. This one does, in fact, have a stative form in it. Acha en redi ns into nf pedes mech besu. This one is the one that has the respective. The other one, I was not sure which one it was, but it was not that one. It is this one. So first we have our particle. And then we have our initial verb, redi, and then a prospective verb, into. NF is, of course, a prepositional phrase. Pedes is a noun, not a super common one. It means chest. Mech is a stative verb. And besu is another noun meaning clothing. Now, actually, I believe, yes, this is a typo. This, yeah, you can have a, I'm sorry, there is no typo. I briefly confused myself. Again, you can see this stuff is confusing. Redi can have its causative meaning while being in the circumstantial. So redi ns ordinarily would mean like she put, but here it means she caused because it is immediately followed by a prospective. And that is legal. You're allowed to do a circumstantial version of that. It's just that you'll usually see it as someone like justifying their actions. Like, I did this in order to cause that outcome. That oftentimes requires a redi plus prospective construction. And that in that case, the ready is, of course, in the prospective. But here, it's just a perfectly normal circumstantial verb. The prospective, to, into, follows it. In this case, it is to be brought. I believe the to here is marking passivity. Yeah, it does not come up a lot, but there is a passive form of the prospective. And I believe that is what is meant here. Yeah, so she caused to be brought to him, NF, a chest, pedes, and then we have our stative, mech besu, filled with clothes. And you'll note that there is not any stative ending here. That is because it does not require one in the third person masculine singular. And that's what chest is. Remember that the stative agrees with the antecedent, pedes, not with the thing following it, besu, which is the logical subject, so to speak, of the stative verb. All right. So the full translation is, thereupon she caused a chest full of clothing to be brought to him. All right. And that is everything that we have. We only went over 4 examples because they're rather lengthy, or at least the first 2 were. Please let me know if you have any questions on the content of this video. And we will start going over stuff in Chapter 9 in the next video.